So the long vigil of waiting for me to get round to making a Deathwatch video has come to an end. Let's talk about the kill team forces of the Auto Xenos in 10th edition 40k, with an overview of their index, the Black Spear task force, all their datasheets, and a few ideas for army lists. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the secretive elite forces of the Deathwatch. Supreme Xenos hunters assembled from a whole variety of chapters, all drawn together for their own expertise, and often to eliminate one given Xenos threat. In the video we'll talk briefly about the armies placed in 10th edition so far, then go through the index, starting out with their core rules and the Black Spear task force, each of their datasheets in turn, and a few thoughts on war gear, and then finish up with some other options for detachments and units from Codex Space Marines, and a few example army lists that have been hitting tournament tables recently. Loads to talk about, so let's read some Litany Xena Mortis and get stuck in. Deathwatch in 10th edition work as an expansion to Codex Space Marines, and as with 9th edition they do have access to basically most of the tools out of the Space Marine army right now. As one of the divergent chapters, they get the vast majority of options that regular chapters do, and then a bunch of units on top of that. So far in 10th edition, they've definitely had their ups and downs. They started their edition as arguably the single most broken army in Warhammer 40k, being able to spam out theoretically something like 70 plus mortal wounds in a single turn of shooting for 2 squads and a stratagem. And even when that was swiftly patched, they still remained arguably the strongest Space Marine chapter for really quite a long time. Their core damage buffs working out rather nicely with Oath of Moment, and some particularly dangerous shooting units like Desolation Marines, though again they got some nerfs following that. Now, since the release of Codex Space Marines, they have been struggling a little bit more on the competitive scene, a win rate of around about 45 to 46%, when previously they were up more like 51, likely in no small part down to their stratagem changes and some increased costs for their best units. The change to Oath of Moment also didn't help them out much, as we'll talk about in a second. In competitive games, they do seem to be currently the single least played faction in Warhammer 40k, though to be honest that's partly just due to how niche they are in general. They just don't have quite as big a following as some of the other factions, though they do get played with a bit more regularity than last in the game when they get strong. In any case though, in this video let's take a look through the interesting rules in Index Deathwatch, and talk through the pros and cons of the Black Spear task force, the individual datasheets including all their kill teams with their crazy war gear combinations, and finish up by looking through other Space Marine codexes, other detachments, and then some army lists. Starting out though, let's take a look at Index Deathwatch, which contains a few main things. They use the Oath of Moment rule from core Codex Space Marines, a kill team's rule for governing the mixed toughness and profile units within their mixed squads that I'll talk about with the datasheets, the Black Spear task force, which gives you the mission tactics special rule with several turns worth of focused damage buffs, 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements, a lot of the stratagems revolving around special issue ammunition, and 11 unique datasheets of their own, all of them found with their points cost in the Munitorum Field Manual. Jumping straight in, let's start with the Oath of Moment, and this one's the core Space Marine rule where you get to reroll hit rolls against one nominated targets which you choose in the command phase. So really quite good for stacking focused damage on one target, though it's definitely nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. In general, I think it's a rule that Deathwatch get on really quite well with, perhaps better than some other chapters out there to be honest, as Deathwatch often tend to be a bit more of a ranged focus army compared with melee, and Oath of Moment does help really focus a whole load of units firepower all on one target. Quite nice for bringing down really big single targets, like say big units of Custodes or Knights or something. For Deathwatch, it's perhaps particularly handy for the turn when you get the lethal hits, which you can get army-wide with the mission tactics, and sometimes it can make sense to literally just reroll everything that isn't a 6 and fish for those lethal hits. Say if you're wounding on a 6, it certainly makes sense to do that, or if you happen to be wounding on a 5+ and your unit was hitting on a 2+, say it was a character or a Proteus kill team with a +1 to hit, again that would make sense to reroll to fish with the lethals, even if it did mean that you got a couple more misses than you might have otherwise. Definitely a strong rule for Deathwatch overall, though I do feel like losing the wound rerolls for Oath of Moment was a bit of a big blow to them. Rerolling all wounds was pretty excellent for their devastating wounds, long vigil ranged weapons where you could get really quite a lot of nasty devastating wounds out of those. And just in general, a fair few of their infantry units tend to have more mid-strength weapons like frag cannons or Infernus heavy bolters and things that rerolling the wound roll was really quite effective with. In any case, it's definitely still a meaningful special rule, and as per normal, it's just great to go on the single thing that you most need to light up this turn, whether or not it's focusing your entire army's firepower on one enormous threat, or focus damage buff that lets an important unit casually destroy something that they otherwise might not have been able to quite kill, whether it's something like a whirlwind firing out of line of sight, or Inceptors coming down to light up some enemies that thought they were safe. Moving on, we get to the Black Spear Task Force, the unique fun and flavourful detachment for the Deathwatch. This one does have a fair few restrictions for units that you can't take if you run it. You're not allowed to run any other chapters as per normal for these divergent chapter detachments, but you're also locked out of a fair few firstborn squads. The notable remaining ones being Devastator squads, Tactical squads, and Scout squads. The rest all went to Legends with the Space Marine Codex. Out of those, Devastator Marines and Tactical Marines aren't considered particularly strong right now, but Scout squads really are. Kind of a shame not to be able just to include 2 cheap squads for 55 points to take the midfield. They really are quite a popular option and can be pretty handy with secondaries as well. Not the end of the world though, Space Marines do have other good infiltrating type options, but I guess that's one small negative to using this detachment compared with a Codex detachment. Otherwise though, the core rule for the Black Spear Task Force is Mission Tactics. This one I think is a really simple and easy one that you can't go too far wrong with. 3 turns worth of interesting damage boosts. You declare them in your command phase and they apply to the entire army. In 1 turn you get lethal hits, so auto wounds on 6s. On 1 turn you get sustained hits, so extra hits on 6s. And on 1 turn you get the Purgatus Tactics, where every critical hit that you get, usually on a 6, will be precision. So a small chance to snipe some characters that can rise to a fairly high chance if you've got some volume fire coming in. For me, the 2 damage dealing ones with lethal hits and sustained hits are probably the ones that are important to get in at least fairly early. I'd want to be using them on turns where you're actually going to be dealing good damage, so depending on how hidden the opponent is and how thick the terrain is, it might actually not really be all that worth it turn 1. Maybe depends whether you go first or second and whether the opponent's moved up and exposed loads of units. Certainly on turn 2 I'd usually want a damage dealer one, and perhaps turn 3 or turn 1 beyond that, trying to get swings in early to dictate the rest of the game. For which one's the most important, this one's kind of well known in 10th edition now, but lethal hits are going to be better against anything that you're wounding on a 5+, so if you're fighting against an entire enemy of vehicles it's usually quite nice, and sustained hits tends to outcompete if you're wounding on a 3+ or better, as then it's just better to have extra hits rather than extra hard hitting hits. The precision could be okay occasionally, I think I'd only really rate that though for if the enemy's got some very fragile but important characters in the midst of their unit, and the unit's going to be too tough to reasonably take down easily. Maybe something like a Spirit Seer in a unit of Eldari Wraithguard for example, that could be kind of nice. You can also flex into each one of these as well with one of the stratagems, so it's good to have these damage boosts on tap if you need, perhaps particularly the lethal hits into tough stuff. Overall, as a detachment rule, I think that it's pretty much reliably going to do at least some good, but it's a bit of an amplifying rule that just helps out your army a bit here and there, as opposed to allowing things to truly operate in very different ways. Getting onto stratagems though, and first up we have Old Reliable Armour of Contempt, worsen AP by 1 when one of your Astartes units are attacked. Always nice to have, as it's a good reactive durability stratagem, particularly good on high save things like Terminators or Dreadnoughts. It is a battle tactic that you can use free with captains, though unfortunately it is the only one in this detachment, which perhaps does limit the draw to using captains a little bit. Next up we've got the Teleportarium, which I'd rate as perhaps easily the single biggest draw to the detachment stratagem wise. For this one you nominate either 1 infantry unit or 2 kill team units that are outside of engagement range. You do this at the end of the enemy turn, and that unit or unit goes back into strategic reserve and comes in via the deep strike rules next turn. A fair few armies are getting some sort of access to that, a little bit of Grey Knight style deployment shenanigans. I feel like it's fantastic value if you can use it on 2 kill team units where it's relevant. That's a lot of very powerful squads being redeployed for new threats. Due to having to come in 9 inches away, I think it's a lot more reliable for delivering shooting than melee, otherwise you're always going to be risking a risky charge, but could get a whole bunch of frag cannons or Infernus heavy bolters where they need to be. I think it's very good on plenty of other Space Marine infantry units as well. Eradicators would love it to get the jump on a powerful armoured target. Hellblasters could set up in some optimal range and a little bit safer than otherwise. That's really quite nice for big chunky units of Devastator Centurions as well. Really good firepower with some las cannons and missile launchers, and their main weakness is movement, so having them hop round the board shooting things is pretty cool. I'd certainly be aiming to make good use of this if you're running Black Spear Task Force. Next up is the Flex, a mission tactic one called Adaptive Tactics. This one allows you to swap your turn's mission tactic to something else that's declared in the command phase. Again, you can get this on 2 different kill team units or 1 Astartes unit. I'd say this is a little bit meh if it's just affecting one unit. On a unit that hits on a 3+, sustained hits is usually just going to be a 25% damage increase, which isn't loads. Lethal hits might be a 50% damage increase for the right units if you're wounding on a 5. Could be pretty usable there for a big unit shooting something tough. The biggest value certainly looks like it would be using it on 2 different kill teams at once. That would leave you with an awful lot of points with a big damage boost on them just for 1 CP, which does seem kind of cool. It's not a battle tactic stratagem, unfortunately, though. Then we've got the 3 special issue ammunition stratagems, and these ones were quite heavily changed in the balance data slate. In previous versions of the game, special issue ammunition has applied to bolt weapons, or occasionally literally just standard bolt guns and bolt rifles only. But for some reason on 10th edition launch, you could basically use it on anything from Space Marine missile launchers and have things like Desolation Marines with a 2+ to wound infantry. That was definitely one of the scarier Deathwatch shooting options at the start of the edition. Now though, they've errated it to only work on bolt weapons, so it's this list here. Basically, this does include the vast majority of bolt-type weapons that you can take on infantry. Though weirdly enough, it omits the heavy bolter and the heavy bolt rifle, so not really very good for heavy intercessors. A bit of a curious decision, that one, I think, as I don't think it would have been overpowered or anything. And you do have things like twin heavy bolters on the Centurions getting it, so it seems just a bit mean to the Indomitor kill team there. In any case, I'd say that for the most part being locked to bolters isn't exactly an advantage. For the majority of Space Marine army lists, they're not used as primary damage dealers all that much. Perhaps some of the most exciting ones are things like aggressors with the twin Boltstorm gauntlets and inceptors with assault bolters. They perhaps could be some of the best targets for this. I feel like with a fair few of the kill teams, and particularly the veterans and the Proteus ones, you might well want to be taking frag cannons or heavy thunderhammers and things. In any case, getting on to the actual stratagems though, first up we have Hellfire rounds for 1 CP. This one gives you the anti-infantry 2+ and the anti-monster 5+ ability. It doesn't stack with devastating wounds. You're allowed to use this on any 2 kill teams or any 1 non-vehicle. I'd argue that this one might be one of the single most powerful ones really. You might well be wounding infantry on a 4+ or 5+ with standard bolters. Having them suddenly jump up to wounding things on a 2+ or big monsters on a 5+ is really quite big. I'd still say the 5+ anti-monster thing would be really quite good with things like Inceptors or Aggressors. With the Twin Links rule, you'd still convert to really quite a lot of wounds there. I feel like given that bolters are generally going to be preferring to fire at lower save stuff that you don't need as much AP for, this one I think is really quite nice. Otherwise, we've got Kraken rounds and Dragonfire rounds. As it is stated on all of these that you can't use them all at the same time, you'll have to choose one, as it kind of makes sense that you're loading one type of ammunition into your bolter. Kraken rounds give your bolt weapons an extra 6-inch range and get to improve AP by 1 against your chosen targets. Again, this one for 2 kill teams again, or 1 non-vehicle. The range thing, I guess, could occasionally be important. Say if you just had a fragile enemy unit that's just a tiny bit out of your reach, that could be big to be able to put a whole bunch of hurt on them. Otherwise, extra AP is nice enough, though a little bit steep at 1 CP, I think. Again, seems nice enough with either aggressors or inceptors though, getting them to AP -2 potentially, really quite good for killing Space Marines at that sort of level. And for kill teams, I guess the Fortis one can bring a fair few bolt shots, or I guess perhaps the Proteus one if you're loading up on the Infernus heavy bolters. And finally we have the Dragonfire rounds. This one gives your bolt weapons both assault and ignores cover. 2 really quite different boosts there. Assault I think occasionally will just be well worth the CP if you need to advance to make an objective, and it's going to make a big difference if you can fire off a few bolt shots when you get there, then all well and good. If you can put down an enemy chaff infantry unit while you're scoring your points, then that could be worth the extra investment. The ignores cover bit I'd say is a bit more niche, and I'd say that's more of a side benefit. Kraken rounds would usually get you the same benefit of ignoring that pip of AP that cover gives you. So I'd say that generally the assault keyword is the big selling point for this one. I'd probably consider Kraken and Dragonfire more niche than Hellfire though, as they go. Overall, out of the stratagems, I feel like Teleportarium is probably the best. Armour of Contempt and Adaptive Strategy are some nice helpful general purpose damage or defensive buffs, and maybe the special issue ammunition ones aren't one of the biggest selling points of the detachment, just meaning that you'd have to have fairly specific units to want to use them for the most part. And even then, I'd say the returns might often be a little bit borderline. Moving on, we come to the enhancements, and starting off we have the Thief of Secrets for 15 points, a fairly cheap and effective melee damage weapon this one, and you can take it with any Adeptus Astartes character, so at least it's fairly flexible. This one gives you +1 strength, +1 damage and +1 AP to melee weapons carried by the bearer. I'd say that's a very reasonable buff for the 15 points that it costs, A Marine Captain's going to be a lot more threatening with Strength 9, AP 3 and Damage 3 on their Power Fist. And if they happen to kill a model at some point in the game, they get an extra +1 to all those characteristics. You could be walking around with Damage 4. Doesn't seem too bad to me. An extra fighty Lieutenant or Watchmaster seems a reasonable way of burning 15 extra points if you had them. The Osseous Key, on the other hand, I'd say is probably the letdown relic out of the detachment. 20 points for an anti-vehicle relic. You get to select one vehicle within 12 inches in the enemy shooting phase for either a -1 to hit or a can't shoot debuff if the enemy fails a battle shock test. Unless you absolutely know that you're going to be fighting against loads of vehicles, I'd rate that one as not really quite as strong given that it's 20 points and not even effective at all against some armies. Even if your opponent has it, if they're really scared of it, they could just keep their most important shooting vehicles outside of 12-inch range if they care. And it's also locked to just a Tech Marine or Watchmaster only, making it even more niche. Overall, probably wouldn't be my first pick, though it could be absolutely effective against the right army. Finally though, and perhaps my favourite two, are the Beacon Angelus and the Tome of Ectoclades. The Beacon Angelus is 30 points, and this one gives you Deep Strike to a unit that doesn't have it, and the Bearer's unit also gets to use the Rapid Ingress stratagem for 0 CP. Definitely not a bad thing at all if you want to try and get a scary unit into melee. In general, getting the option to Deep Strike on units that shouldn't have it is really quite a powerful one. It means that you could set up a pretty powerful ranged Alpha Strike, maybe with some kill teams like the Proteus one perhaps, or I guess maybe deliver things like Aggressors, which will particularly enjoy the Rapid Ingress rule, or even jump in some Eradicators to just teleport them onto the board. As with a Teleportarium, that could be an interesting way of getting the Jump Strike on enemy vehicles, and Rapid Ingress might even allow them to get within their terrifying melter range. Overall seems like a very usable option if you'd like to build around it. Finally, there's the very costly but also very scary Tome of Ectoclades. This one is a 40-point one that you can give to a Watchmaster or Captain only, and this one triggers when you use the Oath of Moment ability once per game. Not only can you select 2 different targets for the Oath of Moment debuff, getting reroll hits against both of them, but at least under the current rules you're allowed to reroll the wound roll against both of those targets as well. The last bit maybe does feel like a bit of a holdover from when the Oath of Moment allowed you to reroll wound rolls, but it's still there on the rule at the moment, and whether or not they do get round to fixing it, they haven't got round to it yet. I feel like perhaps in the January balance pass or something there's at least a reasonable chance that they might both remove the wound roll bit and also reduce it in cost. In any case, it is very pricey, but I'd say that's still well worth it. Casually boosting your Oath and getting full hit and wound rerolls against another target in the same turn could give you a spectacular turn worth of damage dealing. And the wound roll bit is particularly interesting with any damage dealers with devastating wounds, things like long vigil, ranged weapons, or kill team terminators with assault cannons, that kind of thing. Maybe at 40 points is not truly auto-include, given that you do give up other options for that, but I feel like it's usually at the cost where it's going to help an army more than it hurts for that cost. Overall, I'd say the enhancements definitely aren't bad. Both the Beacon Angelus, Tome of Ectoclades, and the Thief of Secrets all seem like they could reliably be well worth the cost. Probably the two on this page being a bit more impactful to the game as a whole though. Overall, I'd rate the Black Spear Task Force as usable enough. It previously was outcompeting the Gladius Task Force before Codex Space Marine came out, and doing so by a fair way then. The restricting those stratagems to bolt weapons only definitely took the wind out of its sails a fair bit, meaning that you now want to build around some significantly more limited units. Still though, it definitely has added value for the Deathwatch kill team unit, which is nice. Has some pretty powerful enhancements and a mission rule that's very hard to go wrong with, plus Teleportarium is strong. It definitely has plenty of competition from the other Space Marine detachments, but is still rated as solidly usable, and pretty reasonable to use if you're just starting out with Deathwatch, which is a bit better than I might say for some of the other Divergent chapter detachments. Moving on to the other half of the index though, and we have the datasheets. Breaking those down, there's 3 more basic squads in the Veterans, Bikers and Terminators, 5 different kill team options with 1 unique in Chaplain Cassius's kill team, 2 characters with the Watchmaster and Captain Artemis, and the Corvus Blackstar Flyer. The only battle line unit in that are the Deathwatch Veterans. The kill teams are not battle line, though given that most of the kill teams make most sense to field in big 10-man units, it probably doesn't matter too much as you wouldn't be spamming more than 3 of them under normal circumstances anyway. Starting out with the standard squads though, and first up we've got the Deathwatch Veterans. Perhaps one of the most interesting and involved datasheets out of the whole index. They do have very flexible war gear options, and they represent the firstborn Deathwatch on the field. You get 5 to 10 veterans for 110 points per 5 or 220 for 10 of them. They do get the kill team keyword as well, so all those stratagems will be a bit more efficient on them. and they basically get the same sort of stat line as, say, a Space Marine Intercessor: 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save, objective control 2, and the base veterans get 3 attacks in melee at strength 4, AP 0. Unlike Intercessors though, they do pay a lot more for that same profile. 110 points means that they just aren't really all that tanky per point. They're definitely a unit that hits a lot harder and doesn't soak up that much fire. The reason for that, of course, is they get loaded up with all sorts of fancy gear. You get 2 heavy weapons per 5 of them, your choice of either frag cannons, missile launchers, or Infernus heavy bolters. And out of these, I'd probably be more tempted by the frag cannons or the Infernus bolters out of the 2. The frag cannons are just quite a nice general purpose profile, having the blast keyword, so it means that if you had a unit of 4 of them, you'd be stacking ridiculous amounts of extra hits on any hordes that you could get within range, and all at strength 7, AP -1, damage 2, with rapid fire D3. The Infernus heavy bolters are basically a great big combi weapon with the choice of either firing a heavy bolter or a heavy flamer profile. The heavy bolter could be interesting for the bolt stratagems which it can use, and the heavy flamers could be interesting for Overwatch. 2 interesting variants of infantry killing there. Then per section of 5 you also get 2 Deathwatch Thunderhammers if you'd like to take one, and these really are quite big meaty combat weapons. 3 attacks hitting on a 4+ at strength 10, AP 2, damage 3 and devastating wounds. These things are pretty much the bane of Terminators, and if you had a squad with 4 of these, most things in the game are going to fear at least a fair bit of damage from them. A section of those would make the squad significantly threatening both to enemy vehicles in combat as well as any shooting that they do. Otherwise, the Sergeant can take a Xenophage Blade, which gets 4 attacks with devastating wounds at strength 5 and AP 2, and the rest of the veterans can choose between Long Vigil melee weapons, strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1, Long Vigil ranged weapons, which are basically just combi weapons hitting on a 4+, and they can also take Astartes shields for a 4+ invulnerable save. They can be paired with either the melee weapons or bolters. Finally, they get to innately reroll hit rolls of 1, which is quite nice but won't stack with Oath of Moment, and that goes up to fully rerolling hit rolls if they happen to be fighting Xenos, which is all very lore appropriate. Their character attachment rules still need an update, unfortunately, like quite a few Divergent chapters at time of recording. Hopefully Games Workshop get round to that in the not too distant future. Currently they're listed as characters able to join the Vanguard Veteran Squad. Not sure what they'll update to. I guess they might just change it to something like characters that can join Tactical Marines maybe, which is a few more than it used to be at least. Overall, despite the points increase, I would still rate these as one of the better data sheets out there. They've got some pretty threatening range shooting with frag cannons or Infernus bolters, and can have some seriously punchy melee with those big Thunderhammers. And while they are quite easy for the enemy to kill in return, at least they do get a fair few objective control points. Could be an interesting unit to maybe lead with a Watchmaster for advance and charge, or maybe have the Beacon Angelus in them for heroic intervention, or could even be a pretty reasonable option for jumping out of Land Raiders or Rhinos to get them into battle safely. Moving on, another one of the more interesting datasheets I think are the Deathwatch Terminator Squad. These are 210 per 5 of them, so a fair bit more than the 185 for standard Terminators now, but they do get the big advantage of getting 3 heavy weapons in the unit, which I'd consider the main selling points. You could have 3 Cyclone missile launchers blazing away, or maybe a triple assault cannon loadout to pair with the reroll wound rolls from the Tome of Ectoclades. Cyclone missiles do just seem very general purpose and let you keep the Storm Bolter though, which is nice for the bolt stratagems. You don't get any additional heavy weapons per the second unit of 5, so it basically only makes sense to field 5 of them. And otherwise they do have some other interesting war gear options. The other non-heavy weapon ones can take Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, which is quite good. And they can take plasma cannons if you'd like to, though in general probably doesn't make sense to risk frying Terminators when the other heavy weapons are as good if not better. Unfortunately their special rule I would say is perhaps fairly bad though. They just trigger a battle shock in your own turn when they charge in. That's alright for maybe denying enemy interrupt or defensive stratagems and things, but even then most of the time they're just going to pass the battle shock anyway. Not really worth the loss of Fury of the First really. Overall a pretty solid datasheet though. Terminators paying a little bit more points to be extra shooty with a bunch more missiles definitely could cause problems. Next up, and perhaps a rarer sight in Deathwatch armies, are the veteran bike squads, 3 or 6 models for 80 or 160 points. These guys are some of the last standard firstborn bikers in existence right now, as the main datasheet got removed from Codex Space Marines, and I wouldn't be too optimistic about them surviving till next time round. The bikers have 3 wounds where the Outriders have 4, but they are significantly cheaper than Outriders, so I'd say their defense is kind of similar, and these guys do hit considerably harder than Outriders do. Per 3 of them you get 10 strength 5 AP 2 attacks in melee, rather than all the strength 4 AP1 ones that the Outrider chainswords do. Overall, for 80 points for an interference unit to move up the board quickly, I don't think they're too terrible. Realistically though, Space Marines have got quite a lot of good options for fast interference type units. I still feel like these might be a bit of a hard sell compared with the Assault Intercessors with jump packs, though I think they're interesting enough. Weirdly, I feel like if you wanted to make a biker Space Marine army work with the Stormlance detachment, these could be kind of interesting just as an out there choice to essentially get more bikes into the same force to try and make the Stormlance worth it overall and count the army as Deathwatch. I feel like these guys might get a bit more value out of the Gladius as well. Being able to advance 6 inches and then also charge with all those strength 5 attacks is a bit more interesting compared with not being able to. It does mean that they could be making first turn charges to clear out enemy chaff. Overall, I would say that they're a bit niche though. Moving on, we actually get into the mixed kill teams proper, and this is where the army rule for kill teams comes in. It might be just a little bit overkill with some slight redundant rules, but it basically just spells out very carefully that the Terminator, Biker and Jump Pack models don't necessarily have those keywords, and regardless of the appearance of all the models, you basically just count them as infantry, and the Jump Pack and Biker models will take up different spaces in transports. It is kind of funny that you might be able to have, say, things like Bikers taking up 2 slots in a Land Raider, or Terminators packing themselves into Rhinos, but I guess that's the way that the Deathwatch roll. They also do talk about mixed toughness kill teams, where a few of them have units that are both toughness 4 and toughness 5. Essentially, those alternative toughness units are checked at the start of the process when the enemy starts making their attacks. So if they were majority toughness 4 at the start of making the attacks, then you'd use that toughness value. If they were majority toughness 5, then you'd use that instead. The Deathwatch player gets to use the highest if they're tied. Finally, they do just make clear that as they count as infantry, you could have things like Outriders being able to finish up in upper floors of ruins and things like that. And it is quite an advantage for those models to get essentially the infantry keyword, as they get really quite big movement characteristics and essentially just goes through terrain like infantry can. Definitely removes some of the downsides, even if they are tied to the rest of a squad that's infantry and will be moving a lot slower than them. Starting out for the kill teams, the Proteus kill team is one of the most big and complicated datasheets in all of Warhammer 40k. A squad up to 10 models strong, you get 5 basic kill team veterans that pretty much follow the same sort of process as the standard Deathwatch veterans, and then for the rest of the models you can either fill them up with more veterans, or more likely take 0 to 4 kill team Terminators, 0 to 2 kill team Bikers, and 0 to 4 kill team veterans with jump packs, basically Vanguard veterans. The squad is 180 points for 5 of them, or 360 for 10, so basically you are already paying for the value for extra Bikers or Terminators in the unit, so it basically never really makes sense to take a squad of 5 of them, as then it's just going to be overcosted. Games Workshop probably should have done something like the Devastator datasheet, where paying for a squad of 5 costs less, where the weighting is to the models that you actually have and the value that they have. For the war gear, the veterans have the same war gear as the base squad, though they are only Objective Control 1, not Objective Control 2, and they don't get the built-in hit rerolls. Interestingly, it gives you even more flexibility as to the war gear for the veterans, as the squad's usually going to be 10 strong, so you can basically equip those veterans with, say, 4 heavy thunder hammers if you wanted to, or 4 frag cannons if you wanted to. You can make a very dedicated little section within the unit there to hit very hard in one way or another. Then, out of those potential 4 Terminators that you can take, 3 of them can take heavy weapons, either the Cyclone missile launchers or assault cannons or things. Again, I'd probably be most tempted by the Cyclone missile launchers at the moment. That's just quite a lot of general purpose firepower they're spitting out. I'd say the heavy weapon Terminators are basically auto-include. Then for the last 2 models in the squads, it's probably either the Bikers or the Vanguard veterans. I'd probably be a bit more tempted by the Bikers overall, given that they get to move 12 inches still, they get the infantry keyword, and they get more defense than the other models. Maybe it's fairly good for tanking hits on, and they could potentially make for some much shorter charges than the unit would otherwise be able to manage. You could have one ranging out the front with its big base, and drastically reduce the distance to the enemy compared with just an infantry squad moving up. Finally, they back this all up with a +1 to hit against any enemy units not below half strength, so the vast majority of the time they're going to be hitting on a 2+ there. They really can be doing quite a lot of fairly staggering damage output. Again, unfortunately, they're still lumbered with characters attaching to Vanguard veteran squads, which aren't a thing outside of Legends. I guess we'll see which way Games Workshop go on that, but it is quite an annoyance at the moment, as until then it leaves us with just the Watchmaster and Artemis to join them, which is quite a lot more limited than throwing things like lieutenants or captains into the unit, which could be quite interesting. Overall, at 360 points, even when you are mixing in Terminators and Bikers, that does leave for a very fragile squad indeed, but one that can really hit kind of phenomenally hard on the first round of attacks. I guess it's just the challenge of just making sure they can do the absolute maximal amount of damage. Genuinely, the character thing is a bit of a shame at the moment. They are exactly the sort of squad that you would want to lead with a character, so hopefully Games Workshop gets round to fixing that soon. In any case, I'd definitely rate them as again one of the more interesting datasheets out of the codex. Next up, we've got the Fortis kill team, 5 or 10 models for 115 points or 230. This one is the one for more standard Tacticus Armor Primaris. 5 intercessors at base with objective control 1, and they swap out their grenade launcher for a long vigil range weapon profile, and then you can fill up the rest with either Hellblasters with plasma incinerators, intercessors with heavy bolt pistols, so basically assault intercessors there, or kill team outriders. Out of those, I'd rate the Hellblasters and the Outriders having the best extra value compared with the Intercessors. So I guess either 3 Hellblasters and 2 Outriders, or 4 Hellblasters and 1 Outrider is the way to go there. Again, it makes no sense to buy 5 of them, otherwise you're just paying slightly increased cost for slightly worse Intercessors. In general, they're a cheaper but also massively less threatening unit compared with the Proteus kill team. They just don't have as much threat with a bunch of plasma and then just some bolt fire and strength 4 melee. Their ability is a bit worse as well, giving them a +1 to hit versus units below half strength rather than above. That one's just not going to apply all that often. Overall, I find it kind of hard to be too excited about these guys. They just don't do an enormous amount of damage. I feel like perhaps the main draw to using them is probably going to be character attachment and making efficient use out of the Deathwatch stratagems. But overall, maybe just feels a bit generalist and not really all that threatening, and still not exactly enormously hard to kill for the cost. Next up, we've got the big and chunky kill team in Gravis armor, the Indomitor kill team. This one starts with 5 heavy intercessors, and then you can add up to 2 aggressors into that, though they don't get the extra AP rule. 2 eradicators with melter rifles, though they won't get the full rerolls against vehicles sadly, though at least one can take a multi-melter. And then up to 2 Inceptors into the unit, though they do lose perhaps the main reason to bring Inceptors in an army with the big close range 3-inch deep strike. Again, these guys are objective control 1, and characters can join the unit if they can join heavy intercessors. Their special rule is that if the unit's below starting strength, they get +1 to hit, and then an extra +1 to the wound roll if they're below half strength, which I guess that's going to trigger at least some of the time, given that they're really quite a big unit with 30 wounds at toughness 6. I think it's fairly reasonable that some enemies are going to do a fair bit of damage to them, but not outright destroy them. I'd say these guys are maybe a little bit more interesting in the Fortis kill team, if just that they bring a lot of wounds to the table at T6 and will need some very focused firepower to bring down. Perhaps particularly interesting as a big unit for focused stratagems and character buffs perhaps. Maybe could be fun with an apothecary biologist for the lethal hits. It is a shame that the heavy intercessors, heavy bolt rifles aren't able to use the Deathwatch special issue ammo stratagem though. Otherwise, I could have seen them being one of the most efficient units to use those with. Again, in general, they don't seem to be one of the most commonly used Deathwatch kill teams. Finally, we come to the cheapest of the kill team, the Spectres kill team in the Phobos armor. This one gets you 5 kill team infiltrators, though they do lose the special rule to deny enemy deep strike at 12 inches, but at least they do still give the unit a 6+ feel no pain, so do help out the durability there. Otherwise, I'd probably be most keen to include the 2 eliminators, which could take bolt snipers or las fusils, and then 2 suppressors with their autocannons, and then one other model that can be another infiltrator, or a reaver or an incursor. I don't really feel that the last model adds that much though. I feel like these guys are at least interesting. Their damage output still isn't really very exciting given that the infiltrators are quite so bad for the cost, but given the suppressors and the eliminators, that still leaves them as perhaps one of the biggest and most interesting Phobos units around. Perhaps could be a fun choice for the Phobos Librarian to join to make them untargetable at long range with a fairly big annoying unit, or a more efficient use of the Phobos Lieutenant for a bunch of lethal hits on some fairly meaningful shots. The move shoot move thing is quite good for him as well, and can allow them to do some interesting skirmishing. Their special rule allows them to return to reserves, ghosting off the table again in a similar sort of way to the Space Marine Scouts do, and could potentially turn up in an annoying location for the enemy next turn, maybe harassing their backfield objective if they've left enough room for a drop. Their damage output's still really not all that great, but at least they're somewhat cheap with it, and having the Phobos keyword on a big interesting unit could be kind of fun. Finally, for the kill teams, we have the madness that is Kill Team Cassius. Maybe I did speak a bit too soon when I said that the Proteus kill team was one of the most complicated datasheets in 40k. Kill Team Cassius was basically what kicked off the modern era of Deathwatch, with Cassius himself leading an entire team of themed veterans, each of them quite clearly from one chapter or another. In the squad you get a big 11 models, so that's Chaplain Cassius himself, 8 veterans on foot, 1 Terminator and 1 Biker. Unfortunately, with the Biker and the Terminator around though, that does leave them at just 1 slot too big to fit in a Rhino by themselves. All of these models combined do have some pretty interesting war gear, and despite having quite a few models, they're not really all that expensive in game, 255 points in total, and despite probably having some pretty suboptimal war gear with a bit of a random mix of profiles at range and melee, they do get a whole bunch of interesting supporting rules. They get 2 deep strike innately, so I guess could rapid ingress if you really wanted to. Cassius's combat litany allows them to get devastating wounds in melee. They get 2 reroll battle shock tests, so are just extra reliable when they're trying to hold down points, and the librarian in the unit gives them a 4+ save against the psychic attacks that they might suffer. Otherwise a fair few advantages, and Cassius himself gets the stat line of a Space Marine Chaplain, 4 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save, hitting on a 2+ in combat with his Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 2 Crozius. Otherwise though, the Terminator chips in a Power Fist. A bunch of them have long vigil combat weapons or long vigil ranged weapons, and for a touch of ranged threats, they can be some sort of threats to Space Marines and things lighter than them. The Psyker has a Psychic Cleanse attack, you've got a Heavy Flamer and a Frag Cannon in there. Overall, despite all these buffs, they're probably in a position where they're still not the most competitive unit really. Most of the models still aren't really all that hard to kill, and their damage output's just very scattergun. They're not really stand out either in range or in melee. At the same time, they're really not that bad though. I feel like in more casual lists, if used particularly well, they're probably not going to hold back the army all that much either. Could be an annoying squad that wants to bully lighter enemy infantry and secure objectives. Could be an interesting and disruptive one to rapid ingress maybe. Overall, for the kill teams, I think the general idea for Deathwatch is that while they might be paying a bit of a premium and they do have some odd things lumbered together, I feel like perhaps the main challenge is to try and make the most out of them with character buffs and enhancements and stratagems in whatever detachment you might have. Quite a few Space Marine units don't get quite as big threat units as, say, the Proteus kill team that can have characters attached to them maybe, and it does in theory make them a pretty good target for things like enhancements or any buff stratagems you might have. It's going to go a bit further on them than most places. Finally though, for the last 3 datasheets, we've got the characters and the Corvus. The Watchmaster is 115 points, and it is a 5 wound character with a 2+ save, and he also gets his 4+ invulnerable. He can only lead the Deathwatch veterans and the Proteus kill team, and he is kind of interesting for the Black Spear detachment as he is one of the ones that can bear 2 of the enhancements. His damage output is okay, he does get 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage D3 with the Lance keyword, so probably a bit more effective than most Space Marine captains there. Lance is rather nice for the +1 to wound, and he gets a couple of Strength 4, Damage 2 shots with no AP at range. Otherwise though, for the main things that he brings to the army are his strategic knowledge. He basically makes whatever Deathwatch unit that he's leading just very disruptive. It's able to advance, shoot and charge, and also fall back, shoot and charge as well. So you could have him leading, say, a Proteus kill team on the board and move them up really quite quickly. Get them into closer shooting range for anything that moved up a little bit, and potentially make a charge for a very, very long way away. Particularly if you had, say, a biker ranging out the front to shorten the charge distance as much as possible. The fallback thing is quite handy as well. Lots of these kill teams pack a punch both at range and in melee. Otherwise, he's got one of those ruinous stratagem abilities that now only applies to battle tactics, so when the opponent's used one, from then on it can only be used for 2 CP. Kind of depends on what army that you're fighting there, but seems reasonable enough to throw on enemy armor of contempt for Space Marines perhaps, or even just the command point reroll to give your opponent more pain when they fail a key charge or something. I feel like that stratagem ability is part of the reason that he costs 115 points, which is a bit more than most characters out there. But I think that between the stratagem ability and his buffing rule, he's not too bad to lead a unit. He does have the option of carrying the Tome of Ectoclades as well, which is pretty interesting in its own right in Black Spear. Otherwise, there's Watch Captain Artemis, which I wouldn't say is quite as strong. He's 75 points for a 4 wound character with a 4+ invulnerable. Hits with essentially a flamer with AP 1 and devastating wounds on a 4+ to infantry, and a mastercrafted power sword with 6 attacks at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2. His buffs allow his units to always be targeted by stratagems, even if they're either battle shocks or if you've used that same stratagem elsewhere on the battlefield already. I feel like that's not awful, but also kind of niche. Basically feels like a worse version of what most other captains do. Most of the time the squad won't be battle shocked, and he's not discounting any CP here. Otherwise he gets one of those rules where he gets 2 revive on death on a 2+ the first time that he's slain, potentially making it a bit more credible that he could go off ranging on his own if he really wanted to. Otherwise though, that feels like just a bit of a mediocre rule. It's only really going to have effect when he dies. Overall, maybe could be worth it if you've got something very specific stratagem-wise lined up, and I guess at the moment the standard Proteus kill teams can't get captains right now. Until that's fixed, maybe he might have a bit of a look in, though I still wouldn't be enormously excited compared with the Watchmaster. Being an epic hero, he can't bear enhancements as well, which doesn't help either. Finally, we have the stealth dropship that is the Corvus Blackstar, 180 points with a transport capacity of 12. Actually, as flyers go, it's kind of durable, toughness 10 at 14 wounds with the stealth keyword, so unlike most flyers in 10th edition, it still does retain that -1 to hit at range. It's a hover flyer, so it can start on the board. I'd say its main role as basically being a first turn unit that can just zoom up a kill team and get them right in the enemy's face, get them to jump out and then hit the enemy very hard with frag cannons or whatever else. For weapons, probably the anti-tank ones are the most exciting. It can have a twin-linked las cannon, then 2 Stormstrike missile launchers, similar to the ones that the Storm Raven gunship gets with strength 10 and damage 3, and then a bonus Hurricane Bolter with a bunch of anti-infantry fire with twin-linked. You can go for a bit more infantry killing firepower with twin assault cannons and the Blackstar missiles though. Otherwise, if it can move over an enemy unit, then it can drop some bombs. You're averaging 2 mortal wounds out of that, as it's 6 dice that get mortal wounds on a 5. Not nothing, but not huge. And then it gets the choice of 2 different extra buffing rules, either getting the smoke keyword or the Auspex array to give it ignore cover. Easily I'd say that the Auspex array is better there. Smoke's kind of rubbish as it already has stealth, and you could just use Armour of Contempt otherwise. Overall, I might have the slightly controversial opinion that I don't really think the Corvus Blackstar is actually all that bad in 10th edition. Certainly compared with the other Space Marine flyers, I think it does compare fairly favourably. You could certainly use it as a first turn delivery mechanism while having better durability than the majority of them and still having some okay firepower with ignores cover. Perhaps the main issue that this one's always had is that it just doesn't really tend to synergize very well with the other things that Deathwatch want to do, things like infantry units teleporting around the board, and it could still potentially be a big problem if it just got shot down with some obscene anti-tank firepower that some armies are definitely packing. Would be a shame if it just landed your own squad in your own deployment zone and took a few mortal wounds into the bargain. I guess perhaps could be interesting enough in the Firestorm detachment with its big selection of stratagems that you can use to support the units there. Overall, for the Deathwatch datasheets, I'd probably rate some of the most interesting ones as the Veterans, the Proteus Kill Team, and the Standard Terminator Squad. The Watchmaster to help ruin stratagems and bear certain enhancements, and perhaps as a slightly quirky choice, the Spectre's Kill Team, which does seem like it could be pretty interesting and disruptive, maybe with a Phobos Librarian for the Can't Shoot Me ability. Deathwatch do have plenty of other strong unit options from Codex Space Marines though, so that's very much not the end of the story. Pretty much anything that's just generically strong will be absolutely fine, but here are just a few ideas for things that might have a little bit more value. Aggressors I do think could be pretty interesting for the bolt stratagems with those twin auto bolt storm gauntlets. Getting anti-infantry 2+ or extra AP could maybe be worth it, plus they do seem like a fairly ideal unit to beacon Angelus in with maybe the Gravis Apothecary. Deep Strike and free rapid ingress does seem like a good way to get their enormous damage output where it needs to be. Otherwise, the standard Space Marine objective support options are pretty good. Inceptors for dropping just next to the enemy at 3 inches away to do secondaries, Scouts if you're not using Black Spear for screening and scrapping over primaries, or Infiltrators to maybe guard the backfield and deny Deep Strike to 12 inches. In particular, they do feel quite nice for when the rest of the army might be kill teams jumping around the board and you might not have much left in the backfield. Otherwise, Eradicators could be fun for either Beacon Angelus or Teleportarium potentially, or Devastator Centurions, particularly for the Teleportarium stratagem. Zipping around the table to gain key lines of sight could be big for a massive unit of them. Otherwise, the Space Marines have plenty of options for other shooting buffing units, things like Incursors, the Combi Weapon Lieutenant, or the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike, all could help out kill team damage output. Most of them are fairly costed in my opinion. Whirlwinds are just handy enough in general for a little bit of precision fire support, maybe quite nice when a lot of your damage might be somewhat short ranged. And of course just anything else in the Space Marine Codex that's all out efficient. Gladiator Lancers, Redemptors, Ballistas, Dreadnoughts, Land Raiders with aggressors in them. There's lots of stuff out there that's just fairly strong damage and defense point for point. Otherwise, beyond the Black Spear, I feel like for the other Space Marine detachments, maybe 3 of them stick out a lot more than others. Anything that's going to be good for close-range shooting army infantry is usually going to help out quite a bit. The Vanguard Spearhead does seem like a particularly good fit for them. The -1 to hit and stealth is good for survivability, but then loads of their options are just really good on ranged infantry. Stratagems for an extra AP and +1 to hit would be very nice on plenty of the kill teams. I guess even Proteus will be quite happy just to have the extra AP, even if they were hitting on a +1 anyway. They can also pull the same vanishing off the board trick as well, and have really quite big reactive movements that could be helpful for the Spectrus kill team. The Gladius Task Force could put some big fire discipline combos on aggressors and things. Again, this would be really interesting if Games Workshop did tweak the rules to allow lieutenants to join, say, the Proteus kill team again. That feels like it could be pretty fearsome with the fire discipline combo on it, but currently you can't get the lethal hits, so it's probably still best on things like aggressors or hellblasters here. Otherwise, just generally being able to advance and shoot, advance and charge, and fall back and shoot are all great options, particularly for things that want to get in close, and packing both ranged and melee in their damage output. Finally, maybe for similar sort of reasons, the Firestorm Assault Force seems like quite a nice fit. +1 strength and assault is pretty nice for units like frag cannons or Infernus heavy bolters. Getting them in range just that little bit easier, and hitting harder when they get there. Could make you consider a bit more of a mechanized Deathwatch approach as well, maybe some repulsors to deploy the kill teams from, or perhaps a Land Raider Proteus kill team could be kind of interesting. I feel like there's more room here for the Corvus Blackstar as well. You could potentially be having Strength 11 missiles and Strength 5 Hurricane bolters, never mind all the stratagems for supporting transported units. The +1 to wound Crucible of Battle stratagem for infantry as well does just seem like a very handy one to have. That's quite a big deal on expensive kill teams. Overall, I feel like these three do compete pretty strongly with Blackspear right now, perhaps particularly Vanguard and Gladius. Currently it seems that quite a lot of Deathwatch competitive lists are going at least fairly light on the Deathwatch unique units, maybe signifying that the kill teams are a bit overcosted relative to other options within Codex Space Marines right now. If Games Workshop does do a bit of rebalancing and kill teams get cheaper for some reason, then I feel like that would probably be a boon for the Black Spear, given that you have so many stratagems that work a lot more efficiently on kill teams compared with other units. Finally though, I thought I'd just take a look at a few Deathwatch army lists that are out there in the wild, taking a scroll through best coast pairings to see what people have been using with them since the codex came out. I will be honest, there wasn't as much data for these guys compared with other armies, but here at least are 3 examples of armies that have got some wins at tournaments, and using the Deathwatch units and options in really quite different ways. First up, I found this Vanguard Spearhead Force by Jason McClendon, who used it to get multiple wins at Meeple ATC tournaments. This one's really quite cool and goes very heavy on the Phobos Marines, including taking a Deathwatch Spectrus kill team with 2 las fusils, 2 autocannon suppressors, a comms array, and an incursor. I'd guess that one might be going with the Phobos Librarian to shield them from enemy sight, unless the Librarian winds up joining the Infiltrators for a godly objective securing unit. Otherwise, it looks like there's a Watchmaster leading a rather terrifying squad of Proteus kill teams up the board. They're in the melee variant with 4 Thunderhammers, a single frag cannon, 1 Hammer Terminator, and 3 Cyclone Missile Launcher Terminators with Chain Fists. And the Watchmaster takes that blade-driven deep enhancement, the one that allows them to set up in the midfield with Infiltrate, so potentially having an absolutely enormous first-turn charge on something critical there. That is pretty terrifying, but also a pretty big investment. That's almost 1/4 of your army. Otherwise, there's a Phobos Captain with the Ghostweave Cloak. He could allow you to redeploy a bunch of units. Depending on how tournaments are interpreting forward deploy units and redeploy, this could be really big if it does allow you just to literally reposition infiltrate type units. Getting to move around that scary Proteus kill team could be massive, and the Spectrus kill team is pretty threatening too. Otherwise, they've got a Terminator Librarian leading a unit of Deathwatch Terminators, 2 assault cannons, 1 Cyclone Missile Launcher, Power Fists and 1 Chain Fist there, so just a generally threatening unit. Could be an interesting one to either rapid ingress or maybe use the Return to Reserve stratagem to put them back in the sky and deep strike somewhere else. Return to Reserves would also be very good on the big unit of Centurion Devastators with las cannons and missiles, being able to turn up at the side of the board and get better lines of sight. And then they've got a whole load of Phobos support beyond that, Incursors, Reavers, 1 unit of Small Inceptors with Plasma, and 2 units of Scouts. Overall looks fun to play, plenty of sneaky goodness with some very hard-hitting units in the Centurions, the Proteus kill team, and the Terminators there. Kind of fun to see a sneaky take on Deathwatch. Otherwise, I was having a look around for Blackspear Task Force lists, and to notice this one by Jeff Cope, who used it to win an RTT of 19 players. Maybe a little bit disappointingly for the purposes of this video, it does look like there aren't any Deathwatch units included in this whatsoever. It is just a basic Space Marine list, this one, and could certainly have been run under the colour scheme of another chapter perhaps. I still think it is pretty interesting though to see the units that most benefit from some of the Deathwatch enhancements and support options. There's an Apothecary Biologist with the Beacon Angelis, presumably leading that big unit of aggressors there. As mentioned, they did seem like a very good choice for rapid ingressing in, then getting a whole bunch of firepower, potentially picking up one of the bolt stratagems if needed, and then getting a charge. There's also a Gravis Captain as well, who looks like he'd be joining that same unit. He's got the Relic Fist and the Tome of Ectoclades, so there should be one turn where a lot of your armies be rolling the wound roll. Then otherwise, there's that big unit of Devastator Centurions that's very nice to put into Strategic Reserve with the Teleportarium, and then jump back somewhere completely new to destroy some enemy vehicles. A bunch of objective control with Assault Intercessors and Regular Intercessors, loads of Inceptors that are just generally great. The bolter ones could pick up stratagems if they wanted to. 5 Incursors for the +1 to hit, 2 Whirlwinds that will very much like the damage boost with sustained hits and lethal hits, and provide some very nice indirect fire support to clear enemies off objectives and things, and then 1 Callous Assassin jumping on and off the board to be doing secondary objectives and also ruining one enemy stratagem. In any case, it looks like it's been successful at a small tournament level, and does have some pretty good options for units that make some of the best use of the Deathwatch supporting rules. The Aggressors and the Devastator Centurions in particular seem well suited. Finally, in a big tournament, I did notice a Gladius task force run by Kyle Thompson, who used this to take second at Du Bois GT. Very impressive to take Deathwatch to a 5-0 victory, and this one seemed to be going Deathwatch just for one enormous punch with a Proteus kill team, looking like they're going to be jumping out of a Corvus Blackstar. It looks like for this event they were allowing the Lieutenant and Captain to join the Proteus kill team. I guess there is some argument to say that they definitely could. I think based on one of the Games Workshop GT rulings, it certainly seems that the intent might be there, given what can join the Vanguard veteran unit in the Legends rules. In any case, the Corvus Blackstar here gets the Auspex array, 2 Stormstrike missiles, the Last Cannon and the Hurricanes, and the Proteus kill team goes for a full shooty variant. 3 Cyclone missile launcher Terminators with Chain Fists, 4 frag cannons, a kill team biker, and a kill team member with an Astartes shield. In that, there's also a captain with Power Fist and the Honor Vehement for some extra fight, and a lieutenant with Fire Discipline, so he could do that entire Fire Discipline combo with the lethal and sustained hits on a 5+. I use Oath of Moments to reroll anything that isn't a 5 or more. If you are playing that the characters are allowed to join, it does seem like an enormously high value unit to be able to put that on. I'm sure GW will get around to fixing it in the not too distant future. It seems very likely that they're intended to. It does seem kind of terrifying though, just throwing basically a massive dangerous shooting unit right up the board to obliterate a whole section of the enemy's army, and then if the enemy doesn't have enough left to completely wipe them out, they're going to pose an enormously scary threat in melee as well. That's the Deathwatch bit, but they're well supported with the rest of the list. Loads of Inceptors, some with Plasma and some with Bolters, Eradicators, Assault Intercessors, Aggressors with an Apothecary Biologist, apparently just foot slogging there, some Scouts and Infiltrators for objective things, and a Lieutenant with a combi weapon. In general, quite a nice well-rounded Gladius list beyond that, going heavy on the infantry and Inceptors. Overall, I feel like Deathwatch definitely have some pretty interesting rules in 10th edition, though I must admit I feel like it's a bit of a waiting game at the moment until Games Workshop does their FAQs and perhaps their next balance pass as well. I feel like a few of the Primaris kill teams in particular tend to be a bit on the pricey side and just aren't quite as interesting as the Firstborn ones given their damage profiles. Could probably afford to be a bit cheaper in points as a result. They definitely feel like an army that's got plenty of options with these enormous kill team units that can put out big massive combos like the one in the Corvus list, or the Proteus kill team infiltrated in the Vanguard force. That again seems absolutely scary. As always, look forward to hearing all your insights down in the comments below though. How have your Deathwatch been performing on the tabletop in 10th edition so far? How much luck have they had in their Xenos hunting? In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way that I can keep such big videos like this coming quite so regularly, allowing me to do YouTube as my main thing. If you have been enjoying the videos quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.